Full Dr. Seuss spoke in Hebrew.
Hachatul? Chatul. Meow. Meow.
But anyhow, on to the topics of our evening. But first, let's talk to God. We'll get rolling. Thank you, Father, for this opportunity you've given to us yet again. And particularly as we're rapidly moving into the holiday period, both of Purim and then shortly thereafter on the Jewish calendar for Passover, and in between comes the celebration of the resurrection. So as we prepare for these times, we would ask that our interaction tonight might be helpful towards those ends, as well as towards the end of getting some things perhaps better settled in our minds and therefore in our lives, so that we can be more effective and accurate in expressing and demonstrating you to those around us. In Yeshua's name. Amen. Let me just see if that was... Okay. That was just a... Sorry, I thought somebody from outside might have been texting us, and somebody was. Turns out it's the scorekeeper for the Red Sox and Rays game, and the score is not good, so we'll leave it at that. All right. First, to start with, last time we were together, we dealt with this question: at what point did Gentiles separate from the early Messianic synagogues to form their own church, and why? Or did some Gentile believers from their own church, apart from the Jewish believers, form their own right from the beginning? And we answered that question, and in answer to that question, I suggested at least a couple books to look at, and I remembered the title of one, but I wasn't sure of the title of the other. So, having set the context for why I'm giving you this, I was talking about books by Oscar Scarsone, Skarsaune, and I mentioned the book Jewish Believers in Jesus, the book that I was just sort of trying to figure out what the title was and almost had it. It is In the Shadow of the Temple. In the Shadow of the Temple. It talks about the early movement within Jewish circles, and as it broadened out into non-Jewish circles, the early Jewish movement of followers of Yeshua. So, having given you that as the promised, recommended bibliography, we're now ready to move on to the questions for this evening. And we'll take them in the order in which we receive them.
There's one from today, so
Yeah.
never too late to get your questions answered.
Oh, and while I'm thinking of it, Barb, hang on after we're done recording for a very quick conversation. Okay. I heard a Messianic rabbi say that Yeshua is not the light of the world. He's only a reflection of the Father. That hit me all wrong, since Yeshua himself said he was the light of the world. Is there some teaching or understanding that would help me better understand this statement? Okay. First of all, and then there's another question that from the same person. First of all, with respect to both this question and the next one to come, I think this particular person, be he rabbi or not, and without knowing who the person is, I can't speak about his credentials or her credentials. No, it appears that it's a he from the question. But anyhow, bottom line is this. It seems to be somebody trying to grapple with an understanding of the Trinity and what that's all about, and how the three persons within the so-called Trinity relate to one another. And I'll just sort of leave it at that, because much more than that we'll get knee deep, then belt deep, and then neck deep in the whole discussion on
In the big muddy.
In the big muddy, yes. Let me just say, by way of general background, since it just popped into my mind to say it, when you're dealing with the whole concept of what has been called the Trinity, I would far prefer to call it the unique unity of God, And gosh, one of my students had an even better description of it, but if it comes to mind, I'll mention it. Here's our problem. I'm trying to remember who the rabbi was. Might have been Nachmanides, but I'm not sure. Who mentions that God exists beyond 10 dimensions. We live in technically 4 dimensions, since time is a dimension, but when we do try to put things out graphically, we work within the 3 spatial dimensions. If God is above and beyond 10 dimensions, and there's every likelihood it's probably better than perhaps an even dozen, but the numbers don't matter at this point, then to try to understand him in a 3 or 4 dimensional world is going to be either logically or dimensionally impossible. So to try to figure all this out to begin with is problematic in a way that makes sense to us at our own levels. It's above our pay grades. And so that's part 1. Part 2 is as the persons of the Godhead interrelate with one another, too often I have seen and heard that rather than actually being spoken of in the sense of a complete equality, often they are spoken of in terms that seem to be more hierarchical. This sounds like it's hierarchical, frankly.
It does to me too.
Or the other possibility is this is someone who's coming from or leans towards something that is called, among other things, the Jesus-only movement. So that effectively they undercut the whole idea of the unique unity of God and speak literally of basically a single or singular God, so that each part of the Godhead then is now a part of the Godhead rather than a person in the Godhead. So in one sense then Yeshua becomes the reflection of the Father, and in another sense the Spirit is Yeshua personified in our lives, but ultimately there's only one and only one God. Sometimes it's viewed as Jesus only, so Jesus is the whole of it. Sometimes it comes across like this in the sense of the Father. It also could very well be motivated by trying to present stuff within what is often called a monotheistic worldview. Now, there's another problem related to this. Actually, there's 2. The person who, or the people who are involved in this, have not bothered to take the Messianic Apologetics course that I teach here at the yeshiva, where we spend the last couple weeks dealing with what are the biblical evidences in Jewish sources concerning the nature of who God is. So we make a stab at this particular concept within Jewish and Semitic worldview perspectives. The other part of the problem is, and this is not a commercial, well, no, it's going to become a commercial in a moment. It wasn't going to be commercial originally. A lot of the discussion concerning monotheism in Jewish circles and in Christian circles derives from the Rambam, Maimonides, and the way in which he presented God as a singular individual.
And what time period was he in?
Maimonides is 12th century. Okay? Now, he was rejected by his peers. Later on, he became the spokesperson for the way in which Judaism has presented the nature of God. And here comes a commercial. Number of years, well, actually it was in the last millennium. I did an article, I think it was in Kesher, although it may have been in another journal, on, forget the exact title, but the subtitle was A Contrast to the Rambam. And you will find that article listed on the Menorah Ministries website, menorahministries.com. And I might remember the rest of it, the rest of the title. But anyhow, I did an article on that to demonstrate what Maimonides did in pulling in the Hellenistic worldview and shunting aside, in that sense, a Semitic worldview on how to deal with the concept of God. His thinking was readily accepted by Christians first, and then it was later by Jews. So much of the discussion across the board is based on that. If you've got a non-hierarchical view of God, then the idea of one being a reflection of the other, rather than it puts you in the camp of, again, parts of Godhead rather than persons within the Godhead. Right? That's a long and large context for this. Now, for anyone who takes the Bible seriously to say that Yeshua is not the light of the world, when if you look up John chapter 8, verse 12, he specifically says, I am the light of the world, then now you'd better take up your argument with Yeshua himself. Now the question is, what does that mean? That's a really good question. Again, let's set it in context. If you look at John chapter 7, 8, and in fact 9, they're set at Jewish holiday time. Now, what particular holiday? When Yeshua said he's the light of the world, frequently people think he's talking during Hanukkah time. He's not talking during Hanukkah time. That's correct. And if you've been in some of our courses, you will have known that already. Boy, that's a lot of commercials. Well,
But the classes are great. They deserve to be plugged.
Thank you, Barbara. I was going to say, if you're not paying for this, then you got to put up with the commercials.
True.
If it's paid TV, you can get away with it.
It's like an ad on.
Yeah. All right.
network
So
TV.
anyhow, the holiday that he's speaking at is the holiday of Sukkot. Now, he's speaking in the Second Temple period, and in the Second Temple period, the holiday of Sukkot had some striking temple-related ceremonies associated with it. One of them was the lighting up of the temple courtyard and the accompanying torchlight dance, mainly by the women in the temple court. And what was lit, we are told, by the rabbinic sources, is 2 huge menorahs. And the menorahs are described in such a way they were probably about 75 feet high. Now, when those were lit during Sukkot, guess what? The whole temple courtyard area would be lit up. People from all over, since it's set on a hill, would be able to see it. The torchlight parade simply added to it. And in the middle of all that, you've got 812 here?
Yeah, right there.
Let me just see if it...
Over here.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying... I think the text may actually say that this was going on the great day of the festival, but I'm not sure. Yes, on the last and greatest day of the festival, we're in 737. All right. So anyhow, on that day, in all likelihood, Hoshana Rabbah, which has all kinds of interesting connections, but not directly relevant to where we are now. It's on that great day, near the culmination of the festival, Yeshua says, I'm the light of the world. Well, you can understand why he's saying that, given what I've just said is already in the background as part of the celebration of Sukkot. This is John 8. Now, this is going to come as a real surprise to you, but in John 1, in the same book, you have the initial reference to light. So at least in the context of John, you already have a setting a literary setting or context. And interestingly enough, this particular text is also going to, this particular paragraph or section of John will be in discussion for the second question that was related to us. And the text says, verse 4, "In him was life, and that life was the light of all people. The light that shines in the darkness, but the darkness does not." This translation has "understand it." Some translations have "overcome it." Whatever the translation is that works for you. And then it continues. Along came this dude by the name of John. By the way, he was a Jewish priest. He was not a Baptist or a Methodist. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light. He himself was not the light. He was only a witness to the light. And then verse 9, "The true light that gives light to every person was coming into the world." So that's the imagery, and perhaps that helps to fill out what he means by calling himself the light of the world, because in his prologue, John, in his gospel, has already set the stage for how this works. It's a wonderful. It's not an analogy, right? It's a metaphor that we're dealing with here.
Which part of it?
The light of the
The
world.
light is a metaphor.
Is a metaphor, yeah. And against this background, darkness has to do with, I don't know, well, hold on a second. Before I run away from this, later on in that same chapter, he uses,
It's a long chapter.
it's a long chapter. No, it wasn't, it's not in chapter 1, it's in chapter 3. I think the light imagery comes back into play. I think the metaphor is fairly straightforward. Where there's darkness, there's now light. So where there was a problem with seeing where you're going or seeing what you're doing, now that there was light shed on that, darkness could in fact represent evil, or it could just represent a lack of understanding. We're not told exactly what it was, but light is frequently used in the biblical texts along those lines. So I would just say, look at some of the texts, not only in John but also elsewhere in the scriptures that talk about light, and I think you're going to find that it has to do with both the aspects of knowledge and of goodness.
Yeah, I don't.
Is that how it's used in the prophets?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me in John and in several prophets, the concept of light, dark is not evil. Dark is ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's two different things.
Right.
Many times, ignorant people are seen as evil, which is giving them too much credit. When you're in some of the imagery in the prophets, if you're in the stumbling around, you're in the dark. That doesn't mean you're doing wrong things. It just means you don't know any better.
Yeah.
And I think that's what John is. It's really more of a metaphor rather than, oh, if you're in the dark, you're evil. No, evil things happen in the dark, but that we shouldn't blame the dark for that. It just means people can't see what's going on.
Right.
Is that fair enough?
Yeah. And in fact, in chapter 9
Of
John, with
John.
the healing of the blind man, Yeshua says something to the religious leadership. Along the same lines, and I think he references them as being blind.
In other words, ignorant.
Exactly.
Ignorant. You don't know the real.
Exactly, which is in
Real
keeping
deal.
with what Patrice
Yeah.
just said.
Yeah.
I could not find the passage quickly, but I know that conversation takes place in John chapter 9. Yeah, it's the conclusion of John chapter 9. He says, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains.
Mm-hmm.
You can see. In other words, this has to do with knowledge and accountability and responsibility.
And discernment. And discernment,
Very good.
too.
Very good.
Not just understanding the facts, but understanding the meaning of the facts and how to apply the facts, which is really wisdom more than knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah. Back to Isaiah. Isaiah 11, I think it's verse 9 says.
People who've walked in darkness have
Oh,
seen
no.
a great light. That's the one I immediately.
That's not the one I was thinking. I think that's chapter 9. But chapter 11, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God. And in other words, everything will be enlightened and lit up. So in that sense.
Yeah, we usually don't say enlightened to be point blank. We think of it automatically as a metaphor.
Yeah.
It's not like, I enlightened you, I turn on the light. It's not the way. We would think that was cute and funny.
Yeah. So I think against the background of, one, the context of when the statement was made, which is in the context of the Second Temple period and the celebration of Sukkot, against the context of the Gospel of John, against the context of Isaiah and the prophets, and in view of, because Isaiah 11 is referring to the time of the Messianic age, in viewing the understanding of the Messianic age, you can see how Yeshua would describe himself as the light of the world, and and we'll just leave it at that. So, with all due respect to the person who thought otherwise, he thought wrong. So, when the questioner says this hit me is all wrong, the questioner is correct, and the person who made the statement is not.
Can I just say something?
Please.
Cool. So literally last night, I didn't even tell you, I was driving our grandson Jonas to our services, and he brought up, we usually talk something about what he's learning in 5th grade. And he says, we're learning about dimensions. I went, oh, that's cool. That's very cool. I enjoyed talking about that kind of stuff. And he says, I said, and what are the 3 dimensions? And sure enough, he goes, length, horizontal, vertical, height, and then the 3rd dimension, which is being a cube. And I said, absolutely. I chatted with him about, my dad was a science teacher, and we used to talk about stuff like dimensions in the car because that's what we did. And he thought it was really interesting. I said, do you know what the 4th dimension is? And I was sure he didn't. I said, well, I'll explain it to you after we get out of the car. So we got to the synagogue, and he got out of the car. He said, are you going to explain it, 4th dimension to me? I said, yes, I will. And so I do the little trick where I go, you stand here for a minute. Okay, you are the only thing that can occupy this space right now. Is that right? He goes, yes. I said, but if I push you out of the way and I stand in the same space you were in, the only reason I can do that is because of the 4th dimension, which is time. So 2 things cannot occupy the same space at the same time, but they can operate in the same space at different times. And he thought that was way cool, and I felt like, yay, I did something good today for my grandson. And I said, if anybody asks you what the 4th dimension is, now you know, here's what you say. And he said, time. And I said, yes. And if anybody asks you what the 5th dimension is, it was a singing group from the 60s, and they are pretty good singers. And so he sort of looked at me like I was nuts, which I somewhat am. But anyway, I just wanted to leave that lesson with him, that if somebody, queries him or asks him. But now, the next time I see him, I'm going to say, oh, remember we were talking about dimensions? A rabbi says that God is beyond. God has more than 11 dimensions. And that's why we can't see him. That's why we can't see him. And that's okay that we can't see him. It's fine.
And thank you for sharing that, because that popped free in my mind. The other thing that was sort of floating in the back there as we were talking about God. It's C.S. Lewis's parable of the squares and the cube.
Flatland.
He derived it from a book called Flatland, and then he developed that spelled it out as a parable. For those of you who have not been in my class, and again, I deal with this in the Messianic Apologetics class on the subject of God. The problem that we face is the problem of the parables, of the problem of the squares and the cube. It goes like this in brief.
I'll use a piece of paper. 'Cause
Sure thing.
It's really good to see something.
That's right. Where there is a population of squares, and they live in a place called Flatland because
They're on this paper, but they're flat.
It's a two-dimensional world, like the sheet of paper. All right. Now, into this two-dimensional world populated by squares, and I make no apology for calling these people squares because I'm not the one who came up with it, but the author of Flatland did, and C.S. Lewis then built
He's from
on
the
it.
1800s, the author of Flatland.
Yeah, so blame C.S. Lewis for calling you squares.
We can use
but anyhow,
this as a cube. Oh, I can't move it. I was going to say we can use that speaker as a cube. Oh, I know. Keep talking.
Okay, so anyhow, into this population, into this two-dimensional world of squares, along comes a square that says, I'm a square, but I'm more than a square. I'm a cube. Now, this isn't quite a cube.
No, but it's
gives you the
two
idea.
cubes stuck together.
Yeah.
But it gives you the three-dimensionality. Instead of the flat piece of paper, now you've got something with 3 dimensions, correct? And to those who are squares, they can only see other squares.
Okay, now this particular cube says, I'm not just a square, but I'm a cube. In fact, I'm 6 squares in one cube. Now, if this were truly a cube, 1, 2, 3,
You can't
4,
see my
5, 6.
my other squares that I have, because you can only see in your own flatland.
So, it does not answer the question. It just illustrates the problem of why we can't answer the question. Because in a two-dimensional world, populated by squares, when along comes a square who says they're also a cube, if they're truly a cube, they are really 6 squares in one cube, but you cannot see
But we can't see it. We can only see what's in our flatland.
Yeah, you can neither see nor comprehend it in a two-dimensional world. We live in a three-dimensional world, and as part of the course, I hand out something I got from, I forget exactly where, that gives you sort of you'll love this, on a two-dimensional sheet of paper, a way in which to sort of picture not just a three-dimensional cube, but a four-dimensional tesseract, which in effect helps you to see or visualize how to try to communicate something like this. So, in effect, a tesseract, and then it tries to unfold the cube into 3 dimensions so you can see what the tesseract would look like. But anyhow, all that to say is that's the problem with trying to figure out how the persons within the Godhead, how they can be three persons and yet one God. All right, I think we've...
Yeah, and in my experience, people who have not been specifically educated in Bible or theology or both of those, or even systematic theology, if I went up to the next 10 people who were walking in to Target down the street and I asked them, please try to tell me what the Trinity is, I would say at least 9 of them would not get it wrong, but maybe one of them would be on the right track. That's how hard it is to explain, because it's not a matter of smarts, it's a matter of conceptualization. And every time you ask people to conceptualize things, it goes better or worse. But especially the Trinity, there is a mysterious aspect to it. In other words, if the squares are told by another square, I am 6 squares in one, I'm not exactly like you, I'm more than you, the
like
originals.
you,
I'm
yeah.
like you, but yes, I am. I have more sides to me than you. If you trust the person saying that, or if you trust the square that's saying that, then you will trust what they say about themselves rather than I understand this. And because every time people say they understand it, it's 3. All they do is kind of say, well, 3 and 3 and 3 is not 1. And Jewish people say you can't explain it because 3 is not 1, and Jewish people worship one God, not 3. So right in the beginning of a whole explanation, it's like, how am I going to express this? Well, it's very difficult to express it. And we've known people in the Messianic movement that we've thought maybe didn't really see Yeshua as part of the Godhead, right? That he was a person that God spoke to specially. But that's different from what he says he is. And as I said, you can get into just a great big fat muddle when you're trying to describe some of these things.
Okay. So yes, 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3. But on the other hand, 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. So to put into a simplified messianic or mathematical formula, there you go. I will add one other thing. We'll close this subject with the words of the Shema. Most people, including Messianic Jews, translate Deuteronomy 6:4 as, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." That is part of Maimonides' problem. I first came across this translation literally decades ago. It's from the Jewish Publication Society in their translation. So it's not something that was coined by the Messianic world. The text literally says, "I am the Lord your God, the Lord alone." In other words, you will have no other gods before me. It's not that I am talking about the nature. It's not talking about the nature of God as a oneness rather than a threeness or a plurality of some sense. It is simply saying, "I'm the Lord your God, the Lord alone. You will have no other gods before me," as is later elaborated, or was earlier elaborated in the 10 words, the 10 Commandments. Something else popped into my mind as I was saying that. I'm thinking.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, the other thing, it relates to the discussion we had earlier in this semester's class on the Semitic versus Hellenistic worldviews or perspectives. In the sense that the Hellenistic perspective is trying to define the essence of God, whereas the Semitic perspective is to experience the character of God.
Or know what he's done.
Or, yes. Thank you.
His deeds.
His deeds. Experience and reflect on his deeds, yes. Thank you. Better that way than the way I phrased it. So, yes, the Lord is our God. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. So the translation we have in our Siddur is not something I concocted. It is something I stole from the Jewish Publication Society.
We only steal from the best sources.
Yeah. So we'll leave it at that. Although I said we're going to leave it at that several times in the last 15 minutes, but we keep coming up
But
with
then
more.
you thought about more things.
And then you had that wonderful thing.
Well, I want to tell you about our grandson,
Yeah, but
because
it's
that
perfect.
was so.
It's
I know.
perfect.
I am going to tell him about the Beyond 11 Dimensions, and I want to see what kind of question he asks about that.
Okay. Now, the questioner goes on to say, the same rabbi said, in other words, this is not helping to enhance the reputation of said rabbi. that Yeshua did not create the world, but just watched as Adonai created the world. Quick definition here before I finish the rest of the question. Adonai is the term that we use whenever we read from the Torah scroll and we see the letters Yod He Vav He, which is not Adonai. It was a name of God that was at one time pronounced by the high priest, usually only on Yom Kippur, in the temple. Since that time, we are not sure how that should be pronounced. And because it's considered such a sacred name of God in standard Jewish tradition, when you read this unpronounced name of God from the text, you substitute for it Adonai. And interestingly enough, if you have this name plus the Hebrew name Adonai, then you say the whole thing. Then when you read the whole thing, it's Yadonai. Adonai Elohim or Elohim Adonai. So, depending on how the things are stacked. So, that's who is being referred to when the questioner says, as Adonai, Yeshua just watched as Adonai created the world, as the Lord created the world. My understanding of John 1 is that Yeshua participated in creation. I need helping understand this as well. So the best way to understand it is to go back to John chapter 1, verse 1. And read it from the beginning. Bereshit haya davar. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be reading in English. That was the Hebrew. In the beginning, and I read it that way because this is intentionally meant to reflect on the opening words of Genesis, which is Bereshit bara Elohim. Here we have Bereshit haya hadavar. So in the beginning was the Word. What beginning? Well, because it doesn't define the beginning of anything, or the beginning of beginnings, or the beginning before the beginning. But since it never really began, because God has always been around, it's beginning as far as we're concerned. Okay, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Interesting term here. Usually in Greek, when you have the word with, it's the term meta. Sometimes sun.
Now Meta is Facebook.
Yeah, now Meta is Facebook.
He stole that word.
Yeah.
From Greek.
This term for with is pros. In other words, it's not the sense of someone being with someone, but they are looking down on someone. When you say pros, it is face to face, eyeball to eyeball at the same level. So the very use of this less common term for with here is an indicator of what's going on here. The Word was with God. He's at the same level. And then it says the Word was God. Now the text literally has that backwards. The Greek text has it backwards, but the only way to translate it into English is this particular word. The best way to translate English is this way. All right, so he was with God at the beginning. All right? Now we've set the stage. Then here it comes. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that was made. That sounds fairly straightforward.
Unless you misidentified the him.
Yes, but since the subject all the way through, the main subject is the Word, and in the previous sentence it was he was with God in the beginning, then the through him grammatically refers back to the same he of verse 2 or the Word of verse 1. And it says, through him all things were made. And in case we didn't get that, and without him nothing was made that was made. Now that seems fairly straightforward, and I think John is trying to make sure we get it in the same fashion. in just that same way, as straightforward as that is. I don't know how much more we can say about that.
Oh, I have things.
By all means, please.
Part of this is a linguistics issue.
Go ahead.
Those of you who know me well will remember that I've told you time after time, prepositions are a problem from language to language. What means in or with or without or underneath may be something totally strange and different in another language. It could be an equal translation, or it could be, yeah, that's not the sense you get in the original language of that text. I'll give you a really good example because it's so clear to us who are English speakers. So our normal way to say something instrumental, if you've ever taken language, you or Latin, you don't have to have taken Latin, but I ate my soup with a spoon, right? I ate my soup with a spoon. I wrote a letter with my pen. Now, in Russian, you must have a difference between accompanying, or with as an instrument. So, if you say the Russian equivalent, I wrote this letter with my pen, it's like I'm writing a letter, and next to me a pen is writing a letter. Or if I ate my soup with a spoon, it's like there's me and my bowl of soup, and there's the spoon and the spoons, and we're accompanying each other. The same word in English, with. That's what I mean by when you're dealing with meta as a preposition, it's not always easy to understand the meaning that was the original meaning from Genesis. The people who knew Greek at this time, they chose meta, but they could have chosen another with.
No, they didn't use meta here.
Oh, they didn't use meta. They used prose.
Yeah.
They could have chosen meta. They didn't. They used prose. That gives it a little different flavor. Just like if I write with a pen, is the pen also writing, or am I using the pen as an instrument? Oh, that's two different things, isn't it? And in other languages, it sounds, as I said, the Russians think you're saying the pen wrote a letter and you were writing it right next to them, so you were writing it together. And that is how prepositions, I don't want to say can trick you, they're difficult. There's not a one-for-one meaning necessarily. There might be a one-for-one meaning, but I wouldn't just sort of count on it and plan on it. That you can say with always means this, and above always means this, and you can't. It's going to be slightly different in every language. It's amazing God trusted us to learn languages, isn't it, really? Wouldn't it be easier if there was just one and everybody understood? I understand that's the way it was at the beginning. And then God said, no, got to have different languages, so I guess this was part of his plan. I don't know, just crazy things I think about. What do you got there, Sparky?
Well, we read the beginning of what's called the prologue to the Gospel of John. I thought it might be good to read the end of it. This is how it concludes. No one has ever seen God. I'm using an NIV translation. But God, the one and only who is at the Father's side, has made him known. How do most translations have it there?
Are you in 14?
John 1:18.
18.
But I think you may have the same translation.
Yeah, has made him known, and it doesn't have anything else in the margin for another translation.
All right.
Well, because it's mainly, this is a Christian edition, so they're talking about only begotten.
Yeah.
Which is a word we use nowhere else in the English language anymore.
Some versions have here the only begotten Son who is at the Father's side has made him known. Mm-hmm. But you'll notice this translation, it properly has God, the one and only, or an alternative translation for that would be the only begotten God. Either way, you get the idea of the fact that the one who was there at the beginning is the Word, and it describes as he was God. It concludes the same way. Yes, he was God. He's the God, the one and only. I like that because it reinforces what we talked about before. I am the Lord, or the Lord is your God, the Lord alone. So this is in keeping with that same thing. All right, is that fair enough? Does that make sense? Okay. So with all due respect, or lack of respect at this particular point, to said Messianic rabbi.
Go ahead.
No, I was basically done.
He may be trying to differentiate his idea of God is different from the Son, or has different activities, and that's different from the Spirit. But every time we start to talk in those ways, in other words, I'm going to give him a good heart. I'm going to assume he's trying to make things clearer. But every time you put the emphasis on how different the persons of the Trinity are, that's when you start getting into really deep, muddy water, and it's very easy to fall over and almost drown. It requires a lot more words than just little phrases. It's difficult. It's difficult to explain.
Yeah, since we're on this, it popped into my mind. Sometimes Yeshua is described as the only begotten Son. Sometimes he's described as the firstborn Son. We are when we use those terms, we are saying something, for lack of a better term, ontologically, that the terms weren't intended to say. These terms are used in a specific way. The firstborn son, or the firstborn child, the firstborn is a term that means the one who has priority. Priority. When you're using only begotten, you're not using the fact that this was the only one who was born or begotten, but that this was unique. If I remember correctly, in Genesis 22, God describes Isaac as Abraham's only begotten. He was not Abraham's only begotten.
And he wasn't the first one.
And he wasn't the first one. He was the one who ended up with the priority. He was, in every sense, unique for anyone of a number of reasons, because he was the only one that was birthed by Sarah, but he was also unique because it was an act of God that produced his birth. So, only begotten does not mean he was the only one that was begotten. Firstborn does not mean that he was first one that was born. Firstborn, again, has to do with the status of priority. Only begotten has to do with the status of uniqueness. So, that's why this translation is a pretty good translation. John 1:18. God, the one and only God. Or if we want to put it into more, in a larger context, God, the unique God, has, if I remember right, the term there is related to the Greek term exegesis, has unwrapped or unwrapped, or how should we put it? Unwrapped, explained, demonstrated, any one of those kinds of terms. Who God is and what God has done. Okay, that's the fourth.
Have we beaten the dead horse enough?
Have we finally done it? Okay.
It's not a dead horse, but
no, by no means.
But commonly discussed.
Yes. Commonly discussed and frequently misunderstood.
Yes.
All right. I think, given where we are on the calendar, rather than move into this question,
okay,
let's talk about the question of responsibility at Yeshua's death, or for Yeshua's death. Yeah.
It's fine with me. When are you going to answer this?
Well, next
This
time.
This is very short, though.
It may get.
Really? You're gonna bring that much to it? Should we make a pile of books and just say, if you want this, read this? No. Okay.
Yeah,
we can do the anti-Semitic problems.
Yeah, let's do that because we could get started on this and find out it takes longer than we thought it was going to take.
Not for me. There's a limited amount I know about that.
All right. We'll throw it out as a teaser, but we won't answer it.
Okay.
How do we know that the particular books of the Bible were chosen correctly, and is there any value in the books which were not selected? I'm going to do a flippant answer. Because every Bible I pick up has these books in it, and no other ones. And that's not just an accident. And is there any value in the books which were not selected? Yes, no, and maybe so. In more detail.
But there's more to it.
But there is much more to it, and I'm not putting down the question or the questioner. But I just want to toss it out as.
By the way, and this is, if you're concerned about that, here's what you can do: go to any public library and look for the apocryphal books. They'll have copies of all of them. They are not secret. You are perfectly free to read any and all of them for yourselves and see what they have going for them. I would recommend, if you want to read something that's sort of helpful, you could read Ecclesiasticus. It sounds like Ecclesiastes, except it's Ecclesiasticus, and it's very, very much like Ecclesiastes, which has applied wisdom. So to the extent that Ecclesiastics, that you're reading it and it would be helping you because you can apply the wisdom to it, you could do the same thing with Ecclesiasticus. There are several different gospels.
Let's not get involved.
I won't, but I was just saying there are also different gospels. If you want to read some gospels, and as you're reading them, you'll probably be able to pick out, well, that seems wrong, or that seems against everything in the Bible. But I'm glad I got to read it for myself. Feel free to do that. In fact, it would be much preferable that people read them so they know what they're saying, rather than either they denigrate them off the top of their heads, or they think there's new secret information that has been squashed by evil enemies. Fill in the blank of who the evil enemies are. But go to your public library. You don't have to pay. You can read them.
Okay. I do need to amend what I said. If you pick up a Jewish Bible, you will only find the books of the Older Testament. You won't find the books of the Newer Testament, obviously. But you will only find the same books, the 39, of the Christian Bible in the Jewish Bible. Fair enough? And let me just add that this, which has 66 books, is not the Christian Bible. It too is a Jewish Bible. Why? Because it was written by Jews. All 66. Fair enough? Okay. So, normally we would be meeting in 2 weeks. But in 2 weeks, we will be having our Purim party.
Yay!
Now, you are welcome to join us for that Purim party. And those of you who are in the vicinity are welcome also to audition for one of the parts in the Purim play.
You don't have to audition. You just have to talk to me.
Yeah. We've got about a half a dozen characters that we want to include in that Purim play. It's
actually the day before Palm Sunday.
Yes, it is. It'll be done in, as we said at the outset, Dr. Seuss style. So, the next time we get together will be in April. And we will be getting together on April 6th, which is the first Saturday, rather than the second
And we're leaving
Saturday.
the next day.
Yes.
And then the 20th?
Yes, we will be getting together the 20th. Now, if you received the synagogue newsletter, it says the 27th. That got through without my double checking the calendar. So
Not-
the
not
6th,
correct.
6th and the 20th of April. So it'll be 1st and 3rd in April. And that sort of makes up for the fact that we won't be getting together on the 4th Saturday of March. Now,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's Easter weekend.
yes. Easter comes in on the 31st, in case you are not familiar or have marked in your calendar.
Easter? No.
March 31st.
Oh, okay, because we were talking about April.
No, March 31st. Now, interestingly enough, Easter is far closer to Purim than it is to Passover. How can these things be? Well, here's how these things can be. This is not only a leap year in the general calendar, it's a leap year in the Jewish calendar.
Well, yeah, leap month.
Well, but it's
Yeah.
called a leap year because we have not a leap day, February 29th, we have a whole leap month, which then pushes Passover back a month later than you would normally expect it. So we have 13 months in the Jewish calendar this year. And we have it every more or less handful of years. Just so you are aware, it does not occur every fourth year. It occurs every irregular number of years. It's regular if you know what that regular pattern is, but when you look at it, it's not a regular series of numbers. So if you want to Google it, you can Google it and find that out for yourselves. But that means this is the last time we will be getting together before the events of what's called Easter week, from Palm Sunday through what's often called Good Friday to Easter Sunday. And this is a week that in many circles, through many centuries, in countries around the world, has been greatly misconstrued as to the events that took place this particular week. It is so badly misconstrued that a number of years ago, Patrice and I had to write a book to deal with some of the issues, and appropriately the title of that book is The Distortion. So if you want more on some of the problems, by all means, pick up the book. It's not a long book at all, but it deals with some very serious issues. It has to do with, or the most problematic of the issues are, who was responsible for the death of Yeshua? Who was responsible for the death of Yeshua? I'm trying to think. I've lost the name of the camp. I think it's Dachau, but I'm not certain. But
Go ahead.
But a former acquaintance of ours who spoke on a couple occasions here at the synagogue, she passed away a number of years ago, was a survivor.
Of Dachau, yeah, she was.
It was Dachau, she survived. And she said when she entered that camp, across somewhere just as she was entering the camp, there was a sign, "You are here because you killed our God." In 1939, after he saw the Passion Play, that's a very familiar play, at least in Europe.
Omer Ab. I can't even say it today. Gao.
Right.
What he said.
That's the main one, but variations in the Passover play.
There's some in
can see-
America too.
Yeah. And in fact, one of our own synagogue members, Angie Hunt, wrote up a re-edited form of the Passion Play to correct some of the mistakes. And she was asked to do that, and the group that was going to put on the edited Passion Play ended up not putting on her.
I don't think that's why.
But it just
didn't help.
It didn't help. it just reinforces the problem. In a traditional Passion play, and Ober Ammergau, by the way, to their credit, they have revised the play so it doesn't come across this way, but for centuries, they reinforced the concept of the phrase, the Jews killed Christ. Or as Rose Price saw, you are here because you killed our God. Anyhow, Adolf Hitler was quoted as saying after he saw this Passion play, everyone should see this, and I'm paraphrasing this, everyone should see this play because then they will understand why I'm doing what I'm doing to the Jews. And unfortunately, down through the years, this misunderstanding of who was responsible for the death of Yeshua has been a problem and has been a foundation for much of anti-Semitism, even to this day in this country. Do you want to address the issue? Or do you want me to start?
Which issue?
Who's responsible?
No,
for
you
what took
start.
place? Okay. Without getting sidetracked, the first thing I'll say, which is something you have said on a couple occasions as you've delivered the drash, what's so good about Good Friday? Well, one of the things about Good Friday is the events that's supposed to have taken place on Good Friday did not take place on Good Friday. Ooh.
Oh, no.
They took place on Wednesday. I originally discovered this when I was in college, as I was reading something called Guide to the Gospels by Scroggie, and I looked at it and I said, wow, that makes a whole lot more sense out of the week then. And since that time, and then with some additional sources, when I have taught Passover or Passover week stuff, I've pointed out that the events of Yeshua was executed on a Wednesday. It was reinforced by something that I read the first time we were in Israel. We rented an apartment. We exchanged our car for an apartment.
We rented an apartment rather than living in a hotel.
Yes, but what it was, we exchanged the use of our car for the use of an apartment. Somebody was associated with the seminary, uses her apartment there. And I was reading something that was a coffee table book, and it was on the temple scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was, what's his name?
Yigal Yadin.
Yigal Yadin was the author, and he pointed out that every year in the Essene calendar, Passover fell on the same day. The Essene calendar was set up in such a way so that the holidays fell on the same day of the week every year, and they adjusted the calendar accordingly. Yeshua
Sort
says,
of like Easter is.
yeah, Yeshua, yeah, because Easter
It's always on a Sunday.
always on a Sunday.
Different dates.
It's a different date, but it's always on a Sunday. And the Essenes celebrated their first night of Passover was Tuesday night. So Passover fell on a Wednesday on the Essene calendar. The Gospels make it clear, I'm not going to take the time to develop this, that Yeshua was celebrating that last Passover in an Essene home, which means he celebrated it on Tuesday night, which means he was executed on Wednesday. So,
The upper room was an Essene home in the city of Jerusalem. Is that fair enough to say?
yes, without getting into any more details, yes. Execution took place on Wednesday. The events leading up to that execution, the Gospels take us out to what is called Palm Sunday. On Palm Sunday was the time when the lambs that were going to be used for the Passover sacrifice were brought in from the hillsides outside of Jerusalem, into the temple courtyard area. There's a lot of detail that is very instructive concerning Yeshua's relationship to Passover, if you understand that process. But anyhow, so he came into Jerusalem shortly after the Passover lambs were brought in from that hillside, and he followed the same path into Jerusalem, by the way. When he came riding into Jerusalem, he was riding on a donkey. Matthew says there was also the colt of a donkey that was involved. That has another connector to an important prophecy back in Genesis 49, which we won't get into.
Does the colt mean it was a baby donkey or a young donkey? Is
Yes.
that what the colt part of it
Yes.
means? I think that's probably the English translation is not very
Not
good.
particularly good. Mama and kid. And by kid, I don't mean as in goat. I mean
Don't get confusing.
baby donkey. Anyhow. So anyhow, he comes riding in on a Sunday. And remember, he's greeted by crowds of people. Those crowds of people were there to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. So, one asks the question, who were these crowds of people? Who would be celebrating Passover in Jerusalem? Jews. And these Jews did what? They acknowledged him as king. In other words, the crowds in Jerusalem on that Sunday before Passover acknowledged him as their king and as their Messiah. And they did so in 4 different ways. I don't know if we necessarily need to spell that out at this point, or should I?
What? Which part?
How they acknowledged him.
No, just in a sentence.
In a sentence. It very quickly can be summarized this way. They called him the Son of David. Son of David, and this isn't the only way they acknowledge his kingship. Son of David was the major messianic title of that day. When you talked about the Son of David, you were referencing the Messiah. So they expressly called him Messiah. So the Jewish people received Yeshua as the Messiah. Okay, so then who was involved in killing him? Well, Acts chapter 4 has the following prayer. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Okay, Acts chapter 4, verse 7. Says, these are the people, this is who were gathered against your holy servant Yeshua, whom you anointed as Messiah. And it says, these are the ones who conspired against him. Herod, not a Jew, although he wanted to be one.
Not the original Herod. It was his son.
Yeah.
But family. Herod family.
Yeah. Herod, the original, wanted to be a Jew. Anyhow, Herod, not a Jew. Pontius Pilate, last time I checked, not a Jew. Together with the Gentiles.
Not Jewish.
Not Jews. And then finally, the people of Israel. So if you're going to blame anyone for this, let's do it in the proper order. I don't remember Herod being blamed. Pontius Pilate is usually viewed as that
poor man.
Poor, beleaguered, innocent man who washed his hands of it.
I feel so sorry for him. You know, the crowds were so mean to him.
By the way, you get an entirely different picture of Pilate if you read the historical material outside the Newer Testament. And by the way, the Newer Testament does point out that Pilate is the one who killed the Jews as they were offering their sacrifices. So that's the kind of character.
He wasn't afraid of anybody. Or anything.
He was not a. No.
He was evil.
Together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were last on the list. So the people of Israel need to be last on the list. But what people of Israel were involved here? Before I do, there's one other text that is appropriate here. As the rabbi writes in 1 Corinthians, Hopefully I can find this.
Well, can you quote it?
Yeah. Let me see if I can reconstruct it. I think he's talking in that section about foolishness and wisdom, because had they been able to understand it, then it says the princes of this world would not have crucified the Son of God. And the question is, who are the princes of this world, or the rulers of this world, so we get it correctly? At least it includes the Romans, but Jewish people and Jewish leadership are never considered among the rulers of this world. I think that the text actually says they would not have crucified the Lord of glory, but I can't find exactly where it is. So that's where the biblical texts lay the blame. I think when Yeshua speaks of it in Luke as well as in Matthew, as he's describing what will happen to him in his last days, he says, the Son of Man will be betrayed and handed over to the religious leaders, who in turn will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will crucify him. So Yeshua expressly identifies the ones who were responsible for his execution as the Gentiles in charge, in other words, the Romans. Ultimately, only Pilate had the authority to have someone crucified or executed. And Pilate is the one then who gives the permission to do so. But wasn't his hand forced? Well, again, this gets us back to the nature of Pilate. Pilate could care less what these people, the Jewish religious leaders, wanted to have done. He was constantly mocking them and trying to upset them, and so he plays the game with them. Part of this is discussed in our book, The Distortion, and then he says, "Here, go see to it. Here he is," and he gets turned over to the Roman soldiers, who are the ones who then execute him.
And he could choose either Barabbas or Yeshua. It didn't matter. It didn't matter to Pilate. He just didn't care which one they killed that day. Mm-hmm. He doesn't care what the crowd is saying very much.
But then people will say, weren't the crowds there and crying, "Crucify him, crucify him"? Well, the question is, who were the crowds, and where were they? Where was the there located? The there was located in a place called Gabbatha, basically the courtyard of Pilate. Is it Gabbatha?
Yes. One of the stones there is.
Yeah, anyhow. And in that courtyard area, or do you want to describe that part?
No.
Okay. When you look at that courtyard area, and we have been on some of our study trips, or most of our study trips, we've taken people to this place.
And you can go there too.
Yes, you can go there too.
That you just have to be told where it is.
Where it is.
Most Christian tours do not take you to this area of Jerusalem.
And in fact, you can actually, because you found a picture of this, you can find
There's pictures on Google Images that you can see if you type in Gabbatha, Gabbatha, which is actually an Aramaic word. Mm-hmm.
It's
you know,
like pavement, right?
the pavement, the judgment seat of Pilate.
Yeah.
That's what it's called, his courtyard, where his trials were carried out. So they were in public,
Well,
outside, not in the building, but outside. So that's why crowds can gather there. Except the whole area is not big. Every time you see this portrayed in films, in TV miniseries, every single time the crowd in front of Pilate looks like thousands of people. It takes almost a panoramic view of how many people are in the courtyard that are yelling at Pilate. Except it just doesn't fit that many people. If there were 100 people, that would be a lot. So it's not thousands and thousands of people. It is possibly 100 people. Furthermore, one of the Gospels...
dozens of people.
Dozens of
would be
people.
the way, yeah.
Furthermore, one of the Gospels at least says they were paid to be there. Why were they out? Why were these crowds of thousands there weren't? Why were they paid to be there early in the morning? It could have been 6 or 7 in the morning, because after that everybody's busy. It's the day before Passover.
No, in this case, it's the day of Passover.
It's a day of...
Because it comes that night.
Because that night.
Yeah.
Everybody's doing other things. So why are they there? Well, some of them have been paid to be there. Some of the dozens have been paid to be there. But while you're looking for that, I just want to emphasize something.
Yeah.
I have heard more than one pastor, and I'm sure you have heard more than one pastor, especially if they're having a sermon on Maundy Thursday or Holy Thursday or Good Friday. They will say, remember those crowds on Palm Sunday? Well, they all showed up at Pilate's judgment seat, and the same people who said, make him king, those same people said, crucify them. And then they just leave that point there like it's true. It's not true. It was not the same crowd. The crowd in the beginning on Sunday had hundreds, possibly thousands, watching what in their eyes would be somewhat of a parade, with the lambs being brought in to be prepared for, they're washed at the gate, by the way. The lambs are brought from the hillsides. They're washed at that gate, which is called today St. Stephen's Gate or Lion's Gate. And then they come in and go up to the inner courtyards of the temple. But on the way, they get dunked in springs. They're right there at that thing. There were tons and tons of people at that event. There were not tons of people, and they weren't the same ones at Pilate's judgment seat on Sunday. So every time the pastor says something like that, that's, I think, really increasing anti-Semitic ideas. It's allowing anti-Semitic ideas. Those perfidious people, they should have known better, but they didn't know better, and so they wanted him to die. No, that's wrong. It's not just, probably not. No, it's wrong, and it leads to wrong understanding about who and what are doing things that I don't agree with. I personally, or anybody personally. Go ahead.
So, crowds numbering in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands, greeted him
On Sunday.
as king on Palm Sunday. Dozens of people on the early in the morning that Passover is going to come in that evening. Were there who cried, crucified him. As Patrice indicated, the text seemed to indicate that they were prompted to be there by the leadership, and they were there at a time when they should when most normal people would have been preparing for the Passover, so that's why we can, among other things, point out that they were prompted to be there, possibly paid to be there, by the leaders. And then other thing to consider is if they were in the temple, Pilate's courtyard area, then they were in danger of, how should I put it? I don't want to use the term defile, but becoming impure and therefore being unable then to celebrate the Passover that evening. So who would these be? Like I said, like Patrice said, and like I said, people who had been told to be there by the leadership. Who was the leadership? The leadership of that time, the Sanhedrin, was the high priest and his associates, usually somewhat of an aristocracy, for lack of a better way to describe it. People who were family members, people who were part of their particular political movement, the Sadducees. I read just 2 nights ago to the class on Thursday night a letter from a rabbi in which he was pointing out the part of the same problem we're talking about. He was dealing with the throwing out of the money changers from the temple. And as part of his particular letter, he pointed out that if people had read these texts clearly, they would have seen that the Pharisees were not responsible for the death of Jesus, as he put it, but the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. I was reading somewhere else earlier this week, and someone quoted a very important scholar of the last century by the name of F.F. Bruce in his commentary on Acts. He put it very clearly. He said the people who were responsible for the death of Jesus were the chief priests and their associates. Okay, so that brings me to one other reflection on this. When you look at the Gospel of John, and it talks about the Jews, early on in the Gospel, you will find that John tells us who he's referring to when he's talking about the Jews. Now, the Greek term that's used there for Jews is the Greek term Judaioi. And you don't need to know a whole lot of Greek to translate that one. Judaioi means Judean. They were Judeans instead of Galileans. And the center of Judea was Jerusalem. And when he talks about these Jews, he says in a parallel passage that these are the chief priests and their associates. So when he uses the term Jews throughout the gospel, particularly as they stand against Yeshua, he's talking about the high priest and the high priest's associates. Just like F.F. Bruce said, these are the ones who condemned Yeshua to death. These are the ones who called out to Pilate and encouraged others as well to call out to Pilate, crucify him. And then they're the ones who, along with Pilate, were responsible for the death of Yeshua. But please remember the order in the biblical text is, again, who? Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel. And again, which people of Israel? The ones who were the chief priests and their associates. As you put the text together, that's how this all plays out. And please remember that literally tens of thousands of Jewish people acclaimed Yeshua, received Yeshua, recognized Yeshua as the Messiah when he came riding into Jerusalem. Oh, by the way, where were they when he was being executed? I'm glad you asked. Luke 23, I think it's verse 27, says, as he was being led off to his execution, they lined the streets and they wept. They were not the ones who cried, crucify him. They were the ones who cried because he was being crucified.
Yeah, that crying on the where Yeshua is on his way to the hill, where he's going to be crucified, and the people lining that path and crying because there's nothing they can do. That's a replication of something that happened exactly in the same way to King David, who, as he was leaving Jerusalem, people were trying to get David to stay, and he said, I cannot stay, I must go now. And people were lining the street and weeping for him. The two scenes are exactly the same scenario, where David should have been allowed to stay in Jerusalem. He took himself away and said, I do not want Jerusalem to pay if I stay king. My son is taking over the kingdom at this point, his son Absalom. And Yeshua is saying the same thing. I want to stay, but I cannot. You must let me go because I am not for here anymore. Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
So where were the people from Palm Sunday? Oh, they were lining the streets later that day. They weren't in Pontius Pilate's courtyard. But the most important thing is, even if you forget all the history and all the background and all this, unless a pastor they can give the story about, here's the reception at Palm Sunday, here's what they said on Monday, Thursday, here's what happened Friday morning, however they want to put it. Who killed Yeshua? Well, you did. And you did. And you did. And you did. And he did. And I did. If that's not the main part of their focus, they are doing it wrong. They're missing the whole point. And they're causing people to resent Jewish people because they want to blame somebody else. But the truth is, we would have done it.
Okay. So, in preparation for properly celebrating the events of Passover week, thousands of years ago, not the Jewish celebration of Passover this year, but in preparation for the week between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, since we won't see you again until afterwards, hopefully this will be of some help. I will conclude by quoting the rabbis of old. They said, if you ever have the opportunity to welcome the Messiah, here's how you welcome him. Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord, which is exactly what the tens and tens of thousands of Jewish people said to Yeshua as they welcomed him on that Palm Sunday. Okay, I think we've
Beaten that dead horse.
overstayed our welcome. Okay, any questions? Obviously, there's much more to that. Where can you, yes, there is a question that we have not totally answered. Where can you get the book, The Distortion? Yes, you can get it on Amazon, or if you want, you can order it from menorahministries.com. It's part of our bookstore here as well. All right. Any questions? Any questions?
Any answers? You wanted Barb to.
Oh, yeah, but we're going to sign off first and then
Sure.
we'll talk to Barb afterwards.
Sure.
Okay. Would you close for us in prayer?
I guess I didn't pray before, did I?
No, you didn't. I did.
Okay. Avinu Malchenu, our Father and our King, thanks for this time together where we can discuss various issues that are important. This is a good time. Usually we don't have time to ask questions and get answers and think about ramifications of things that we learn about. But Father, we thank you that you've given us this little bit of time, and we pray that you would help us as we walk alongside you, that you would show us where to find accurate information that we can depend on, and also help us to understand that we can trust you more day by day as we learn more about you. Thank you for being so good to us. Be with our families and our loved ones, as you always are, but help us to realize that you are there with them too. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen.